Welcome to the third video in your notes on the ecology unit. So this video is going to talk all about community interactions, so things that happen between different species in a community and allow that community to continue to function. So the first thing we need to talk about is a habitat versus a niche. So a habitat is all of the biotic and abiotic factors in an area where an organism lives. But an organism's ecological niche is all of the physical, chemical, and biological factors that they need to stay to survive, to stay healthy, and to reproduce. So a niche includes its job in the environment, where it lives, specifically where it lives. Is it in the tops of trees, or is it in the bottom of the tree? So an ecological niche is everything about the organism, everything it needs to survive. So your niche would include your house, where you live. It would include your job as a student, being successful at your job as a student so your parents don't get really mad at you and take away your cell phone. Your cell phone might be an essential thing you feel like you need to have to survive or to stay healthy and happy. So a niche includes everything about the organism that it needs for physical survival. So let's kind of break this down a little more. So a niche is food, abiotic conditions, and behavior. So I'll give you an example. The antelope use tall grasses on the savanna for food. So they eat the grass, which would make them a primary consumer. The lion occupies the same area, uses the same area of the tall grasses, but it uses it for camouflage so that it can hunt. The lion is going to eat the antelope, making it a secondary consumer or even a tertiary consumer. So the lion eats the antelope as food, and it modifies its behavior to hunt in low light times like dusk and dawn so that it can sneak up on its prey a little bit better. So the lion's niche would include the tall grass that it uses to hunt. It would include the time of day that it hunts. It would include what it does in the heat of the day. So a lion is going to hunt mostly in the evenings or at night, and then during the day it's going to lie low and just try to stay out of the hot sun. So all of that makes up the niche for both of those organisms. Something else to keep in mind when we're talking about community interactions and things that happen in a community is something called competitive exclusion. So competitive exclusion, here's what it means. Two species compete for the same resource. One species is always going to be better suited to the niche than the other species. So what will happen is it'll either adapt or become extinct. So here's an example. The North American gray squirrel was introduced in Great Britain in the 1800s. The red squirrel that's native to Europe wasn't very as well adapted to the niche that it was occupying. So what happened is the gray squirrel started to take over. So now the red squirrel population is declining as a result of that. So unless the red squirrel finds a way to be adapted to its environment a little bit better, it could potentially become extinct. So it can result in two different things. The first thing is niche partitioning. The resources can be divided naturally based on competitive advantages. So the way this could happen with the squirrel population, one squirrel would eat the nuts from the top of the tree while the other eats nuts on the ground. That way they're both getting what they need from their environment, but they're not necessarily competing for it in the same space. So if the gray squirrel is a better climber than the red squirrel, then it's going to eat obviously from the top of the tree. The other thing that can happen is divergent evolution. So divergent sounds kind of like divide. So they could start off as similar in the niche they occupy, in the way they look, and all those evolutionarily the same thing. But what would happen is one squirrel could select for larger teeth. So this will make a little more sense once we really talk about evolution, but the gene for large teeth would become more common in that population so that it can crack larger nuts. And then the other one would select for small teeth so that it can eat smaller seeds and still survive. So shifting gears a little bit, we're going to talk about ecological equivalents. So okay, so that must mean things that are similar but not exactly equal. So they are species that occupy similar niches but live in different geographical regions. So originally, the red squirrel and the gray squirrel would have been ecological equivalents. The red squirrel occupied the niche in Great Britain, and the gray squirrel occupied the niche in the United States. Well, they lived in different areas, so they didn't necessarily compete. I have another example for you of this. The mantella frog and the poison dart frog. Both frogs occupy similar niches, but they're on different continents. So one's in Madagascar and one's in South America. And Madagascar's off the coast of Africa, in case you were wondering. But the mantella frog and the poison dart frog both have bright coloration that's going to help warn predators not to eat them. Because if they're eaten, they have a highly poisonous toxin that they release as a result. They both prey on similar insects and live in similar habitats. So they're ecological equivalents. They live in the same type of environment, but they don't live on the same continent, so they're not competing for the same resources. Competition versus predation. So let's talk about this. Competition. If you're competing for something, you're fighting for something. If you're competing for the national title win, you are fighting against the other team for that victory. Well, competition in an ecological setting isn't very different from that. It's when two organisms fight for the same limited resources. So the resource, if you're the national title competitor, is that one trophy, that one bragging rights. You won the whole thing. Predation is when one organism captures another and feeds on it, and so that it can live. So a predator-prey type of relationship. So let's switch gears. So all relationships are not necessarily a bad thing. Relationships between species don't always hurt each other. There are some things that relate well together. We call that symbiosis. So it's a close ecological relationship between organisms that live in direct contact with one another. So sometimes they're good things for both parties, and sometimes they're not so good things for both parties. So there are three types of symbiotic relationships, and they are mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. So let's dive into what each of those means. So mutualism is the first one. If you're mutually benefiting from something, or if it's a mutual thing, it's together. So a mutualistic relationship is one where both organisms benefit from the interaction. So think about the honeybee and the flower. So the honeybee lands on the flower so that it can eat to live. But at the same time, it picks up the pollen from the flower and transfers it to the next flower that it rests upon, meaning that it's sharing genetic information from one flower to the next, helping in pollination. So we talked about this a little earlier, but that's an example of a mutualistic relationship. Both organisms benefit from the interaction. The second type is called a commensalism, and this is when one organism benefits while the other is just kind of like, yeah, it doesn't hurt me, it doesn't help me, it just is what it is. So there are a lot of interactions between organisms like cows and egrets or birds that land on the backs of the cows and eat the bugs off the cows so that they can live. But the cattle, I mean, it doesn't really benefit or harm them for the egrets to live in close relationship with them. You also have things like the sea anemone and the clownfish. Think about Finding Nemo. So Nemo lives in the sea anemone. You know that word he can't really say in the movie? So Nemo lives in the sea anemone, and when Dory tries to swim into the anemone, it stings her. Well, that's because the sea anemone is has that function so that it can protect itself. But the clownfish is adapted to be immune to those stings. So the clownfish can swim in and out of the anemone, which gives it protection, but the presence of the clownfish really doesn't help or hurt the sea anemone. It just kind of is. So that adaptation makes for a commensal relationship. The next is parasitism. This is when one organism or one species directly harms the host. Unlike predation, parasites will keep a host alive, could be for days, could be months, could be years. So a parasite will live off of the organism while not killing it. A predator-prey relationship would be the organism kills the other organism, or one species kills the other. So an example that I think is quite an interesting example is the braconid wasp lays eggs inside of a caterpillar. Then those eggs live off of the caterpillar. They find their nourishment from the bloodstream of the caterpillar, and they get what the caterpillar eats, the eggs eat. Well, when the eggs hatch, they eat the caterpillar from the inside out. So that bottom picture there is showing you a caterpillar as it's being eaten from the inside out by these little eggs that are growing into wasps. So that is definitely a parasitic relationship where the wasp uses it to reproduce, but it doesn't help the caterpillar at all. It kind of kills it. So just a quick graphic to kind of show you symbiotic relationships in a kind of fun way. A mutualistic relationship is where they both have a little love, and the honeybee and the flower is a really good example of that. A commensal relationship is like the whale and the barnacles, where the barnacles live on the whale, but the whale's kind of like, meh. And then a parasitic relationship would be like a flea or a tick and a dog, where it's stealing from the dog and threatening to kill the dog, but it doesn't kill the dog unless it's carrying some disease. But that concludes our community interaction notes for today.